May 8th, 1945. An airfield outside Munich. The air is thick with the scent of pine and the sharp, lingering tang of high-octane fuel. Under the dappled sunlight of a Bavarian spring, a line of Messerschmitt Me 262s stands in eerie, silent formation. These are the Stormbirds, the world's first operational jet fighters. Machines that only weeks ago were the most feared predators in the sky. Now they're ghosts. Their mottled green camouflage is chipped. Their glass cockpits are clouded with dust. A group of American infantrymen wanders among them, running grimy hands over the smooth, rivetless skin of the wings. There is no triumph here, only a hollow silence. The engines that once roared with the power of 1,000 horses are cold. These planes, designed to secure a 1,000-year empire, are now nothing more than abandoned toys in a giant's playground. But as the soldiers marvel at the futuristic shapes, a different group of men is arriving. Men with clipboards, wrenches, and a hunger for secrets. The war for the skies is over, but the battle for the technology of the future has just begun. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe was a broken titan, a shadow of the force that had once terrorized the skies from the English Channel to the Volga. The strategic bombing campaigns of the Allies had turned the great industrial hubs of the Ruhr into moonscapes of twisted steel and scorched earth. Yet, in the midst of this architectural ruin, a terrifying paradox was emerging. While the German army retreated on every front, their aviation technology was leapfrogging decades ahead of the rest of the world. In subterranean factories and hidden forest assembly lines, the Third Reich was producing machines that defied conventional logic. Rocket-powered interceptors, sleek flying wings, and jet-propelled bombers that could outrun anything in the Allied inventory. The situation on the ground was one of desperate, grinding attrition. The Luftwaffe had plenty of airframes, thousands of them, in fact, but it had run out of almost everything else. The black gold of the German war machine, synthetic fuel, had vanished as the Allied 15th Air Force systematically dismantled the Reich's hydrogenation plants. At airfields across Germany, brand-new Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s sat parked in long, tidy rows, their tanks bone dry. Pilots, some as young as 16 with barely 10 hours of flight time, were expected to take these sophisticated machines into the air against the 1,000-plane raids of the Americans and British. The sky was no longer a theater of conquest. It had become a mass grave for the Hitler youth of the air. This collapse created a surreal landscape for the advancing Allied armies. As the Western Allies pushed from the Rhine and the Soviets hammered from the Oder, they didn't just find burnout wreckage. They found pristine, technologically advanced aircraft hidden in the most unlikely places. In the middle of the Autobahn, under the cover of thick forests, the Germans had built makeshift runways. Here, the elite Jagdverband 44, the squadron of experts, operated their Me-262 jets, taking off on the highway while Allied fighters circled overhead like hawks. The German pilots would land, taxi their jets under the canopy of trees, and camouflage them with branches, hoping to survive until the next sortie. The sheer volume of these abandoned assets was staggering. At the end of April 1945, the German Air Force still officially possessed over 3,000 first-line combat aircraft. However, the command structure had completely disintegrated. Orders from the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, Ministry of Aviation, were ignored or never received. At Recklen, the Luftwaffe's primary testing ground, engineers began to realize that their life's work was about to fall into the hands of those they had spent years trying to destroy. Some chose to sabotage the planes, smashing delicate instruments and pouring sugar into fuel tanks. Others, fearing the vengeful advance of the Red Army, hoped the Americans or British would reach their airfields first, preserving the machines as bargaining chips for their own survival. This technological treasure trove represented the spoils of war on a scale never before seen in human history. To the Allied High Command, these were not just trophies. They were the blueprints for the next era of warfare. The P-51 Mustangs and Spitfires that had won the war were suddenly obsolete in the face of the German turbojets. There was an unspoken, frantic realization among the big three powers. The war with Germany was ending, but the technological race for the Cold War had already begun. Every airfield captured was a potential goldmine of aerodynamic data that could tip the balance of power for the next half-century. As the smoke cleared from the final battles in Berlin and the Bavarian Alps, the Great Harvest began. The Allies were no longer just soldiers. They were scavengers in a high-tech graveyard, looking for the remnants of a fallen eagle that still possessed the power to change the world. As the dust settled on the wreckage of the Third Reich, a shadow war erupted between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. The prize was the Luftwaffe's intellectual property. In the final weeks of the conflict, the United States had initiated a secret program known as Operation Overcast, later renamed Operation Paperclip, with the goal of securing German scientists. However, while the men were the priority, their machines were the tangible evidence of their genius. The Allied intelligence services knew that the Luftwaffe had been testing swept-wing designs, ramjets, and even rudimentary stealth coatings. The race to seize these aircraft was not just about military curiosity. It was a desperate dash to ensure that the next generation of jet fighters would be built in Kansas or Moscow, rather than being buried in a German forest. The Americans established a specialized unit known as the Watson's Whizzers, led by Colonel Harold Hal Watson. This team of hand-picked pilots and engineers was tasked with a singular mission: find, repair, and fly the most advanced German aircraft back to Allied-controlled territory. They operated in a chaotic environment where the front lines were blurred. Often, Watson's men would arrive at an airfield only hours after the infantry had cleared it, sometimes finding German ground crews still standing by their planes, waiting for someone to tell them what to do. At Lechfeld, the Whizzers discovered a motherlode of Me-262s. In a bizarre display of post-war pragmatism, the Americans recruited former Luftwaffe mechanics to help service the Jumo 004 engines, which had a notoriously short lifespan of only 25 hours. To the east, the Soviet trophy brigades were operating with even more ruthless efficiency. Under the direct orders of Stalin, Soviet engineers fanned out across the Soviet occupation zone, targeting the great underground complexes like Nordhausen and the Junkers factories in Dessau. Unlike the Americans, who were often content to take the airframes and the data, the Soviets were interested in the entire industrial ecosystem. They dismantled assembly lines bolt by bolt, loading specialized jigs, wind tunnels, and half-finished prototypes on trains bound for the Ural Mountains. The Soviets realized that they were behind in jet propulsion, and the captured German Heinkel and BMW jet engines were the shortcut they needed to bridge the gap. The British, too, were deeply involved in the scramble. The Royal Aircraft Establishment, RA, at Farnborough was hungry for data on the Arado AR-234, the world's first jet bomber, and the Heinkel He-162 People's Fighter. The British were particularly interested in the aerodynamic properties of these machines, as their own jet program, led by Frank Whittle, had focused on centrifugal flow engines, while the Germans had mastered the more streamlined axial flow design. The scramble for these planes was often a game of finders keepers. Allied units would occasionally paint over German markings with their own roundels or stars and stripes immediately upon capture to prevent friendly units from claiming the prize. This period was characterized by a strange, temporary truce between former enemies. At captured airfields, it was not uncommon to see a U.S. Army Air Force pilot sitting in a cockpit, being coached through the startup sequence by a German pilot who, just weeks prior, might have been shooting at him. The language of aviation became a bridge. The complexity of these aircraft was such that the Allies couldn't simply figure it out on their own. They needed the very men who built them. These German experts were often eager to cooperate, seeing it as their best chance to avoid the starvation of post-war Germany or the grim fate of a Soviet labor camp. By the summer of 1945, thousands of Luftwaffe aircraft had been cataloged, but only a fraction would ever fly again. The rest were massed into giant collecting points, vast fields of aluminum that stretched as far as the eye could see. These graveyards were the final resting places for the pride of the German Air Force, awaiting a fate that would see most of them melted down into the raw materials for a new, peaceful Europe. The transition from lethal weapon to historical artifact or industrial scrap was rapid, marking the end of the Luftwaffe's existence as a fighting force and the beginning of its life as a ghost in the annals of military science. The fate of the Luftwaffe's fleet wasn't merely a matter of logistics. It was a multifaceted dismantling of a nation's military identity. To understand what happened to these planes, one must look through the lens of the technological angle. For the Allies, the captured German airframes were like alien artifacts found in a desert. The Messerschmitt Me-163 Comet, a rocket-powered interceptor that could climb to 30,000 feet in mere minutes, defied everything the Americans knew about sustainment and safety. The engineers at Wright Field stood in awe of the swept-wing designs, a concept that promised to break the sound barrier, something straight wings could never achieve. This wasn't just about winning a war. It was about the birth of the supersonic age. The data gleaned from these wings would eventually find its way into the DNA of the F-86 Sabre and the Boeing B-47 Stratojet. Parallel to this was the tactical angle. In the months following the surrender, the skies over Europe and America saw a bizarre sight. German planes flying in formation with Allied fighters, but with the Bokenkreuz replaced by White Stars or RAF roundels. These were the testing sorties. Allied test pilots, like the legendary Eric Winkle Brown of the Royal Navy, took these machines to their absolute limits. They wanted to know exactly how a pilot felt when the Jumo engines flamed out, or how the Me-262 handled in a high-speed dive. These flights were incredibly dangerous. The German jets were notoriously unstable, and several Allied pilots lost their lives mastering the enemy controls. Every hour flown was a lesson in how to defend against and how to build the next generation of aerial predators. Finally, we must consider the human angle. Behind every captured aircraft stood a team of German ground crews who were now guests of the Allied forces. In many cases, the relationship was surprisingly professional. At the Whizzer bases, German mechanics were often given better rations and living conditions than the civilian population in exchange for their technical expertise. They were the only ones who knew the delicate temperament of the WW2 engines. There was a strange, silent understanding between the captors and the captives. The war was over, the politics were dead, but the machines still demanded respect. These men spent their days teaching their former enemies how to keep these temperamental metal birds alive, even as they knew that every flight took the secrets of their homeland further away. While the Western Allies were meticulously flight testing their prizes, a more aggressive philosophy dominated the enemy angle. To the Soviet Union, the Luftwaffe planes were not just research subjects. They were reparations for the 27 million lives lost during the Great Patriotic War. At the Junkers factory in Dessau and the Heinkel works in Oranienburg, the trophy brigades didn't just take the planes, they took the factories. Entire production lines were uprooted, the machines greased and crated, and shipped on flatbed rail cars to the east. The Soviets weren't interested in just the how of flight. They wanted the how of mass production. They stripped the wings off finished Heinkel He-162s and loaded them into cargo holds, effectively transplanting the heart of German aerospace into the Soviet interior, where these designs would eventually morph into the early MiG jets. Then, there was the leadership angle. For the Allied High Command, the existence of these advanced aircraft presented a significant political and moral dilemma. There was an internal struggle over whether to display these machines to the public as a symbol of victory or to keep them shrouded in the highest levels of classification. General Hap Arnold of the Yuzof was a staunch advocate for secrecy, fearing that if the American public saw how far ahead the Germans had been, it would undermine confidence in the current U.S. fleet. Consequently, some of the most advanced prototypes, like the Horton Ho-229 Flying Wing, a craft that looked like a 21st century stealth bomber, were whisked away to high-security warehouses in Maryland, hidden from the world for decades to prevent their radical shapes from being photographed by the press. Finally, we encounter the moral angle. After the liberation of the concentration camps, the discovery of the V2 rocket sites and the underground Heinkel factories revealed a dark truth. Many of these miracle planes have been built with slave labor. This realization changed the nature of the Great Harvest. To some Allied soldiers, these planes were no longer marvels of engineering. They were monuments to cruelty. In several documented instances, U.S. and British troops, overcome by the horrors they had witnessed at nearby camps, took sledgehammers and axes to the sleek fuselages of captured planes. They saw the blood of the innocent on the duralumin skins of the jets. This tension, between admiring the genius of the machine and loathing the system that produced it, would haunt the technical evaluation teams throughout the post-war years, casting a permanent shadow over the legacy of the Luftwaffe's final fleet. The climax of this technological scavenge centered on a race against time and the elements, spearheaded by the audacious mission of Watson's Whizzers. By June 1945, the urgency had shifted. The initial curiosity had been replaced by a logistical directive: get the best of the Luftwaffe out of Germany before the borders of the occupation zone solidified and the Iron Curtain fell. Colonel Watson knew that if his team didn't move fast, some of the most significant aeronautical achievements in history would either be seized by the Soviets or rot in the rain. He established a collection point at Cherbourg, France, a port city that became the gateway for German technology to reach the United States. The logistics were a nightmare of Frankenstein engineering. The Whizzers had to ferry dozens of Me-262s, Arado 234s, and various piston-engine fighters across hundreds of miles of war-torn Europe. Because the Jumo 004 jet engines were prone to catastrophic failure after just a dozen hours of flight, the pilots were essentially flying on borrowed time. Every takeoff was a gamble. Without proper manuals or radio beacons, the American pilots followed the scarred remains of the European rail network, navigating by sight. At Melun-Villaroche, a temporary airfield near Paris, the Whizzers set up a high-speed maintenance depot. Here, they stripped the planes of their guns and armor to save weight, painting large, flamboyant American insignias over the swastikas to avoid being shot down by jittery Allied anti-aircraft batteries who still associated the silhouette of a jet with a Luftwaffe raid. The tension peaked at the docks of Cherbourg. The British aircraft carrier HMS Reaper had been tasked with transporting these prizes across the Atlantic. This was a great harvest of steel. Using massive cranes, the crew hoisted nearly 40 of the finest German aircraft onto the deck. The sight was surreal: a Royal Navy carrier, its deck packed tightly with the very machines that had tried to sink the British fleet only months prior. To protect the delicate duralumin skins and exposed jet intakes from the corrosive salt spray of the North Atlantic, the planes were coated in cosmoline, a thick, gooey protective wax. They looked like mummified relics of a future that had arrived too early. As the HMS Reaper pulled away from the French coast in July 1945, it carried more than just metal. It carried the cumulative research of Germany's greatest aerodynamicists. But the journey was perilous. The Atlantic was still a graveyard of shipwrecks, and the precious cargo was top-heavy. On the deck, the Me-262s and the exotic Arado bombers were lashed down with heavy steel cables, their wings almost touching. While the ship churned toward Newark, New Jersey, the men on board knew they were transporting the keys to the next war. This wasn't just a delivery, it was a transition of global power. The era of the propeller was sinking into the horizon behind them, and the jet age was waiting on the American shore. When the HMS Reaper docked in Newark in late July 1945, the arrival of its cargo was treated with the secrecy of a nuclear operation. The planes were not paraded through the streets. Instead, they were quickly craned onto barges and whisked away to Wright Field in Ohio and Freeman Field in Indiana. This was the moment of the Great Dissection. For the engineers of the United States Army Air Forces, the war had not ended. It had simply moved into the laboratory. Here, the climax of the Luftwaffe's story transitioned from the drama of the battlefield to the precision of the microscope. At Wright Field, the Americans established foreign technology centers where every bolt, every turbine blade, and every control linkage was analyzed. The intensity of this work was unparalleled. They discovered that the Germans had mastered axial flow turbojets, which allowed for much thinner, more aerodynamic engine nacelles than the centrifugal designs used by the British and Americans. When they dismantled the wings of the Messerschmitt P.1101, a swing-wing prototype captured at Oberammergau, the American engineers were stunned. The mechanism allowed a pilot to change the angle of the wings in flight, a concept so revolutionary it would eventually lead directly to the development of the Bell X-5 and, decades later, the F-14 Tomcat. The Soviets, meanwhile, were conducting their own frantic climax of evaluation. At the II Flight Research Institute in Ramenskoye, captured German pilots and engineers were forced to assist Soviet test pilots in mastering the temperamental Jumo 004 engines. The pressure from Moscow was immense. Stalin had made it clear. The Soviet Union must have a jet fleet by the 1947 May Day parade. This led to a period of forced evolution. The Soviets didn't just study the planes. They reverse-engineered the metallurgy of the engine blades, which had to withstand immense heat without the rare alloys the Germans had lacked. The climax of this effort was the birth of the Yak-15, a Soviet fighter airframe literally built around a captured German jet engine. Across the Atlantic at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, the British were pushing the Heinkel He-162 Volksjager to its breaking point. These tests were often terrifying. The He-162 was made largely of wood and held together by acidic glues that sometimes ate through the very airframe they were meant to secure. During one high-speed test, a British pilot witnessed the tail of the aircraft vibrate so violently it nearly disintegrated. Yet, through these dangerous trials, the Allies learned the limits of high-speed aerodynamics. They were no longer guessing at the physics of the sound barrier. They were using the wreckage of the Luftwaffe to map the path toward it. By the end of 1945, the intellectual harvest was complete. The Allies had drained the Luftwaffe of its secrets. The blueprints had been copied, the engines had been run until they exploded, and the flight envelopes had been mapped. The climax of the story was the total absorption of German aeronautical genius into the military-industrial complexes of the East and West. The planes themselves, once the most guarded secrets of the Reich, were now hollowed-out shells, their purpose served. They had transitioned from the vanguard of a new order to the raw material for the Cold War, leaving the world to decide what to do with the thousands of tons of duralumin still rotting on the fields of Europe. As the strategic value of the Luftwaffe's technology was extracted, a cold, industrial reality set in. For every trophy aircraft preserved at Wright Field or Farnborough, there were 10,000 others that had become a logistical burden. By 1946, the continent of Europe was a massive, open-air junkyard. The aftermath was not a period of preservation, but of systematic erasure. The Allied air disarmament commands were established with a grim mandate: ensure that Germany could never again take to the skies. This meant the total destruction of the Luftwaffe's remaining physical infrastructure. The scale of the smelting was industrial. In massive collection points like the one at Landsberg or the sprawling meadows of Schleißheim, planes were lined up wingtip to wingtip, not for flight, but for the furnace. Teams of choppers moved through the rows with hydraulic shears and oxyacetylene torches. They decapitated Focke-Wulfs and sliced the wings off Junkers bombers as if they were butchering livestock. The high-grade aluminum, known as duralumin, was a precious commodity in a starving, broken Europe. It was melted down in portable smelters right on the airfields, cast into ingots, and shipped away to be reborn as the mundane objects of peace: spoons, pots, corrugated roofing, and even the frames of the first post-war Volkswagens. This was the alchemist's end for the Luftwaffe. The sleek, lethal machines that had once bombed London and Warsaw were literally being hammered into plowshares. In the British zone of occupation, the RAF oversaw the destruction of nearly 10,000 aircraft in less than a year. The process was ruthless. To save time, some airfields were cleared by simply bulldozing the aircraft into giant pits and covering them with earth. To this day, construction crews in Germany occasionally strike the buried, crushed remains of a Messerschmitt engine or a rotted propeller blade, the fossilized remains of a discarded empire. The psychological impact of this mass destruction on the German population was profound. For years, the Luftwaffe had been presented as the pinnacle of Aryan achievement. Seeing these miracle weapons being cut up by bored teenagers from Iowa or Lancashire was the ultimate proof of total defeat. There was no dignity in the end. There were only the heaps of twisted metal and the black smoke of burning rubber and magnesium. The sky, which had belonged to the Luftwaffe for the early years of the war, was now empty of their presence, leaving behind only the scorched earth and the hollowed-out skeletons of their hangars. While the furnaces of Europe consumed the majority of the fleet, a different kind of survival was taking place across the Atlantic. In the United States, the massive surplus of German aircraft at Freeman Field created a crisis of space. By 1947, the initial fervor of Operation Lusty had cooled. The jet age was moving so fast that the very planes captured as future technology only 2 years prior were already becoming historical curiosities. The U.S. government, realizing it could not keep every specimen, issued a scrap or save order. This led to a heartbreaking period for aviation historians. Dozens of one-of-a-kind prototypes, including rare Junkers and unique Arado night fighters, were unceremoniously pushed into the path of the scrapper's torch to clear hangar space for the new American B-36 bombers. However, a few lucky survivors escaped the furnace through the foresight of men like General Hap Arnold, who ordered that at least one of every significant type be preserved for a future national museum. These survivors were crated and shipped to a storage facility in Suitland, Maryland, under the care of the Smithsonian Institution. For decades, these planes sat in what became known as the Silver Hill Facility, a collection of dark, unheated sheds where the world's last Dornier Do-335 Aero and the only surviving Arado AR-234 jet bomber gathered dust. They were the orphans of a dead regime, waiting for a time when the world was ready to look at them as history rather than as threats. In Germany, the survival of Luftwaffe aircraft was even more precarious. The Allied Control Council had banned Germany from possessing any military aircraft, and the fledgling West German government was eager to distance itself from its Nazi past. Many planes that had survived the initial post-war scrap drives were hidden by private citizens or former pilots. In one famous instance, a Messerschmitt Bf 109 was found decades later hidden behind a false wall in a barn. These barn finds eventually became the backbone of private collections and regional museums, such as the Deutsches Museum in Munich, which painstakingly restored a handful of airframes to their former glory, stripped of their wartime ammunition, but preserved as masterworks of engineering. The final tally of the aftermath was lopsided. Of the tens of thousands of aircraft the Luftwaffe operated during the war, fewer than 500 complete airframes survived into the 21st century. The vast majority of these are static displays, their engines forever silenced. They serve as silent witnesses in museums from London to Washington, D.C., and from Moscow to Berlin. They are no longer weapons of war, but educational tools, often displayed with their panels open to reveal the complex clockwork of a lost era. The aftermath turned the Luftwaffe from a living, breathing threat into a fragmented puzzle of aluminum and steel scattered across the globe as relics of a failed ambition. The story of the Luftwaffe's end is a haunting reminder that technology, no matter how advanced, is ultimately a servant to the cause it represents. When a cause collapses, the machine is left behind as a hollow shell. Looking back from a vantage point of the 21st century, it is clear that the Great Harvest of 1945 was the most significant transfer of scientific knowledge in history. The swept wings of the Me-262 and the axial flow turbines of the Jumo engines didn't just die with the Third Reich. They were the seeds from which the modern aerospace industry grew. The DNA of these scavenged planes lives on in every commercial airliner that crosses the Atlantic and every supersonic jet that patrols the skies today. Yet, there is a somber philosophy to be found in the rusting remains of the German Air Force. These machines were the pinnacle of human ingenuity, built during a dark era where genius was weaponized to an extreme degree. They represent a peak of engineering that was achieved at the cost of total moral bankruptcy. Today, when we see a preserved Messerschmitt or a Heinkel in a museum, we are looking at more than just a plane. We are looking at a cross-section of history, a moment where the world stood on the precipice of the future, built on the ruins of a devastating past. The Luftwaffe planes did not simply disappear. They were absorbed, dismantled, and repurposed. Some became the pots and pans of a rebuilding Germany, while others became the secret blueprints of the Cold War superpowers. Their journey from the cutting edge of the 1940s to the museum floors of today marks the transition from a world of total war to a world of rapid technological evolution. In the end, the fallen eagle provided the wings for a new age of flight, serving as a permanent, silent monument to the terrifying power of human innovation and the inevitable consequences of its misuse.